Okay, thank you for inviting me here today. Can you hear me okay at the back? No, a bit louder. Okay, so I wanted just to start by saying I'm here today to talk about the Place Standard evaluation and the general findings from the Place Standard tool one year post-launch. I made a really big, probably terrible assumption when pulling together the presentation today by assuming that you've all heard of the Place Standard tool. Can I just take a moment to if you raise your hands, if you've all heard of the tool? Okay, good. Phew, that's not so bad an assumption. So I don't need to spend some time actually talking to you about the tool itself. Okay, so today I thought it would be really useful to give you an overview of the evaluation in terms of the aims, the methodology, the main findings, and then some evidence of where we've taken some of the findings from the evaluation and put some of them into action. Hopefully, for those of you that have already used the Place Standard tool, you'll be able to take some of the learning and hopefully it's familiar with what you've found when you've used the tool. But for those of you who are thinking about using the tool for community planning or spatial planning, you'll be able to take some of this learning back with you today. Okay, so when I was initially asked to evaluate the Place Standard, a lot of people were talking about impact and what impact the Place Standard is having. And I suppose for me, I felt this would be a real challenge because I think we heard earlier about lots of different factors influence some of the longer term outcomes that we might look at in terms of impact. So health outcomes, place-based outcomes, they are over a much longer term. And we were also really conscious that the Place Standard is a tool to facilitate discussion, but longer term impacts are influenced by a number of different things such as welfare reform, fiscal policies. So I think we felt it would be really difficult to evaluate the actual tangible impact of the Place Standard in quite a rigorous way, given that there's so many external factors that contribute. So for this reason, we thought it would be much more useful to do a process evaluation. So a process evaluation really looks at how a policy or programme has been implemented. Has it worked well? Have people used it? What way have they used it? And really this gives us an understanding of how the Place Standard is likely to contribute to some of its impacts. So again, the aim of a process evaluation is really just to understand how a policy or programme worked and how people reacted to it. So there were three evaluation aims. The first was really to understand the reach of the Place Standard across Scotland, so who is using it and how it's been used. The second was to understand how, or really just to capture and share local implementation learning. So how is the Place Standard being implemented locally? What's the key learning and what are the barriers and facilitators to using the tool? And finally, it was really about capturing and sharing this learning so that people like yourselves, if you're thinking about using the Place Standard tool, hopefully you can take some of this learning away with you today. So the methodology we applied, we decided that it would make most sense to use case study methodology, and the reason why we did this was because the Place Standard has been used in such varied contexts. We had examples of it being used at very localised levels for community planning, or we had examples of it being used at much more strategic levels to inform, council strategic planning. So we thought the most appropriate methodology would be to use case studies. We chose what we call a more kind of purposive sampling. The reason for this is to account for all the variance, but also to account for the fact that the evaluation happened quite quickly after the Place Standard 2 was launched. So it was launched in December 2015, and we began to identify some of the case studies quite quickly after that. So we carried out 25 in-depth interviews with implementation leads, so maybe some of you are actually in the audience today, so it's just to get an understanding of how you actually used the tool, how you applied it. We did some observations and document reviews, so actually going out and observing how people were using the tool. In terms of answering the first evaluation question, which was about the reach of the Place Standard across Scotland, we established a database and linked up with a lot of local authority leads and tried to get an understanding of how often the Place Standard has been used locally, but also who it is that's using it within these areas. So the 5 case studies, I'm not going to go through these in any detail. The findings are much more high level across all 5 case studies, but this was just to give you an idea of the case studies that we used. So we had East and Bartonshire, Hillhead and Hairstains area, and the place standard was used as part of the locality planning process. It was used in various different ways, so they did surveys, focus groups, one-to-one, very targeted engagement, and they got about 500 responses from that, and then used that to inform their locality planning and their LOIC. We also had a case study in Greenock and Broomhill. So this is quite a deprived area in Greenock that's undergoing a significant amount of regeneration. So the place standard was used as a focus group exercise. It was about 4 focus groups and about 10 participants in each focus group. The 3rd and 4th case study were both used, the place standard was both used as an online survey, and I suppose this comes into when we're talking about more innovative and engaging with people in a less traditional way and looking at opportunities for doing it online. So Shetland Island Council, they used the place standard online and they got about 900 responses from that. And Fife were quite a similar approach, so they used the place standard with their People's Panel members. They sent it out to about 2,000 members and it got about 900 responses back. And these were both to inform kind of strategic planning and also the development of the locality plans. Finally, I think you've heard from some other charrettes today as well. So the final one was an example of a community consultation where the place standard was used as a charrette process, and it was really used as focus groups and one-to-one exercises. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the main part of the evaluation in terms of the actual findings. Okay, so the first aim was to understand the reach of the place standard across Scotland, and we've got a map up here to give you an illustration of how often the place standard has been used across different local authorities. So we estimated that there were over 80 instances of the place standard being used across Scotland. Now, use could equate to, one use could equate to someone using it as a focus group exercise, or it could equate to someone using it as a large kind of survey, so it's very varied in terms of its use. We estimated that about 11,000 individuals had been reached from the place standard tool or been involved in some sort of engagement or survey or community engagement using the tool. And finally, we estimated that about 70% of local authorities have signed up to using the tool or have used the tool. So I must apologise if your local authority is on this map and it's not colour-coded or it's incorrect. Please do email us and tell us where you're using it so we can update some of our reach figures. We found that the place standard was most commonly used as a tool to support community planning, to support community engagement. It felt like it worked really well to engage with community members. It was an easy tool to use. People liked the more kind of visual representation of it. And we found that it was applied across very varied scales. So some people were using it at very local levels, so quite small locality areas, and other places were using it across a whole local authority. So it was very varied in its use. One thing I did want to highlight is that our reach data is likely to be significantly underestimated. I think the reason for this is because we've got very good links with local authorities and local leads established in a lot of the local authorities to report back where the place standard has been used, but we've got much lower links with voluntary sector organisations and communities. So if myself decided to go and use the place standard tool in my local area, I wouldn't think to report it back through the system. So we do appreciate that these figures are probably an underestimate. Okay, so in terms of the key themes and learning that hopefully you can take away with you today, there were 7 key themes that have emerged, and I'll go through them in the subsequent slides. So the first one was around about engagement, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with what the challenges might be with around about community engagement. What implementation leads reported back was that it could be really challenging in obtaining representative reach. So generally, one of the findings was that there's more women than men that would engage, and across a few of the case study areas there was quite a low or no representation from children and young people. And I think I saw a stand earlier with children and young people kind of as the focus of it, and I thought, that's a really useful finding, because I think in order to engage with young people, they had to think about that at the start of the process, to get involved with educational services, or actually just to go out and speak to young people, and that would have been a key learning to make the representation better across the area. Implementation leads reported that it was really important to raise awareness, particularly using online and social media, being really conscious that actually you should be using Facebook, Twitter, the social media way of actually raising awareness that the place standard consultations are going on, and not just using the traditional kind of reporting techniques. And one of the things that implementation leads reported back was that there's this need to move away from traditional engagement methods. I think this came up in the panel discussion earlier as well, around about moving to do much more things online and engaging with young people. So one or a couple of the areas, what they did was that they held open door sessions, and they were really poorly attended. It was you get the people that would typically turn up, but you wouldn't necessarily get a range across your community. So it was something there about not just holding open door meetings and trying to be much more innovative in engagement methods. I suppose the most important thing that came out was around about a much more targeted engagement approach. So a couple of the case study areas identified groups that they would want to engage with in advance, and they based this based on inequalities and protected characteristics. And what they did was they went out and engaged with the groups where they would typically meet. So if the addiction services group met on a Monday night, they would actually go out, turn up at their meeting and carry out place standard engagements there. And I think that was probably a really good example where if you target your engagements and plan it in advance, then you're able to get a much more representative reach across your area. I've included some nice quotes. I won't go through them all because there's quite a few there, but I think probably one of my favourite ones is one here that says, people living chaotic lives or struggling with welfare reforms are not going to come through the doors. They won't have the confidence we need to go to where they would be. So I think in terms of reducing health inequalities and actually making an impact, we need to go out there and identify who we'd want to engage with and be much more proactive in their approach. Okay, the second key theme was around about importance of context. So I think I've mentioned that the place standard is used in very varied scales, and I suppose it's to say that that's a good thing. It's good that it's flexible and can be used in different ways, but it's important just to be mindful of your context and how you might want to use it. I think what typically happened was that if it was across a smaller scale, it tended to be more focus groups and one-to-one exercises, whereas across a much larger geography, it tended to be surveys that people use. This is a quote here from one implementation lead that he said that I would also say there's a question around about the scale of place in which the place standard could be applied. I think the place standard works best on smaller scales. So that was a perception from one implementation lead. However, there's also examples where others didn't feel that was the same and it actually worked well across larger scales. Okay, key skills, these seem the obvious ones. 3 key skills to implement the place standard were around about project management, facilitation and analytical skills. In terms of the analytical, it was much more about how you actually analyse the data. So there's a wealth of data being collected from the place standard tool, but there isn't necessarily the knowledge of what you do with that data. How do you bring together data from lots of different sources? So if you've got focus group data, one-to-one, online data, what do you actually do with that data? So I think implementation leads reported back that you really need someone on the implementation team or on the team that has experience of qualitative data analysis. Again, that's just a couple of quotes that say this process would definitely benefit from having someone who's skilled and competent with data analysis, particularly qualitative data. Okay, resourcing, this seems an obvious one, but the resource obviously was dependent on the scale and the context in which the place standard was used. Obviously, if you're using it across a whole local authority and getting thousands of responses, the resource required to analyse that data is going to be higher than maybe doing a couple of focus group exercises. So the resource to implement the place standard was generally dependent on the context in which it was used. I think we found that most resource was attributed to staff time, so a lot of the time there wasn't a lot of additional funding allocated to actually carry out the place standard work, but local leads were mindful of actually the staff resource and the staff capacity involved in actually delivering the place standard tool. I think this is just one example here of Shetland Islands, where they got over 900 responses from their online survey, but that equated to about 5,000 qualitative comments, and someone actually went through each of the comments and coded them, and it was a huge amount of resource. So I think if you were using it, you might want to be mindful about how you would use it, and then the resource you might want to allocate to analysing the data and the approach you would take, because you don't necessarily have to do a very rigorous approach. You might choose to do it in a less rigorous way. Okay, number 5 was around about achieving buy-in, and this was quite an important one across 3 different levels. So it was important to get the senior buy-in, because that was particularly important in terms of implementing the tool, but also delivering some of the actions. So who was responsible for delivering some of the priorities that came out of using the place standard. Stakeholder buy-in was really important as well. I think a lot of the implementation leads reported that often some of the actions sat out with their role. So if it was if the issue was transport, then where transport on the implementation team and bought into taking some of the actions forward. And finally, community buy-in was also identified as being important. So if we're using the place standard with the community, it doesn't necessarily mean that the council's always responsible for delivering on the actions. Sometimes the communities need to also be brought in, and I think we mentioned about the community leaders taking a role in actually delivering some of the actions as well. This is just a quote here that one of the implementation leads talked about the place standard, saying, "I think one of the key learning points is the place standard can be everybody's tool. It's not just a tool for community planning. I think in order for it to be a success and lead to actionable changes, then a mix of community planning, transport, finance, housing, education should be involved." So I think there was an initial assumption that a lot of the place standard was just a community planning tool, and community planning should be responsible for taking it forward and taking the actions forward. However, I think where it worked well was actually acknowledging that it needs spatial housing and finance all bought into delivering on the place standard. Number 6, we're almost at the end here. So number 6 was around about managing expectations. So I think there's a real risk that you deliver on the place standard and you engage with the community, but you don't manage the expectations as to what will actually happen next. So you're asking for their opinion and their input in terms of what you could improve in an area, but we're not necessarily managing expectations around about that. So I think in order to take some learning away from that, it was about actually communicating some of the results. So once you've delivered on the place standard tool, go back to the community, to almost validate the results so that you can show them what you found and also tell them what you're actually going to do with the data. And being open and honest about what the place standard process is about. It won't necessarily, so if the area wants a brand new pool or a brand new theme park in the local authority, it's about being realistic about what could be achieved. Again, I wouldn't read all of them out, but the danger with doing anything like this is that it raises expectations, and it's a responsibility on the council to deliver and fix everything. The final theme is around about delivering actions, and this probably came out as one of the strongest, most important themes. Obviously, if we go back to the first slide around about evaluating the place standard impact, I suppose there will only be an impact if the right people are being engaged in identifying their priorities, and then actually those priorities are delivered on and taken forward. I think the longer term impacts of the place standard are obviously dependent on whether that happens. However, implementation leads were very mindful that there's lots of different constraints around about availability of budgets, buy-in across services, other people delivering it, so it's not as clear-cut as that's the priority and that will get delivered. There's lots of competing priorities there. There was one thing that came out about being clear about whose responsibility it is to take some of the actions forward. So you might be responsible for engagement with the community and delivering the place standard, but it might not necessarily be your role to take some of the actions forward. So I think implementation leads felt they wanted some further clarity on that from the beginning. And finally, if you are using the place standard tool, it would be worth trying to align it with some strategic or financial decisions that are going to be made across the council. I think some good examples were the locality planning process recently, where that was to inform the local outcome improvement plans, and that provided a nice kind of lever to use the place standard to influence that. Okay, so again, just a couple of quotes here that it says, we cannot afford to do all this work engaging with the community and nothing happens. Okay, so in terms of some positives and negatives about the place standard tool itself, generally it was perceived positively, particularly as a tool to support community engagement. It was straightforward, easy to understand, and helped to add another layer of understanding about a place. So if you're using it with the SIMD data and lots of other your kind of administrative data, you can add that kind of community context onto that and try and get further understanding around about what some of the national data sets mean. And I think people felt like the diagram was quite a powerful representation of place. In terms of the negatives of the tool, people reported that there was quite a lot of duplication between some of the themes, so moving around, transport, it was quite too much duplication between the themes, and sometimes it was difficult to use opportunistically, so it's quite a long kind of process. It's 14 questions. To take someone through it, it could take maybe half an hour, and I think implementations leads felt that if you did meet someone in the street and wanted to ask them about the place standard, it wouldn't work well for that process. The language was described as quite complicated, particularly if using with certain groups. So one area used it with primary 2 and 3 age children, and what they did was they just simplified the language of the tool in places. And finally, one of the criticisms of it was that NHS and education were not explicitly referenced within the different themes. Finally, one of the key points that implementation leads made was that overall the qualitative comments were perceived as being much more important than the score. So I think there was a kind of discussion around about being so fixated on the place standard score, so whether it scored a 3 or a 4, rather than just trying to understand the meaning behind each of the score. And the meaning was much more important in terms of delivering on some of the priorities going forward. What implementation leads found that if you took the average of the score using a survey, everything scored around about 3 or 4, and it didn't give you an understanding of why that thing scored a 3 or 4. So if it was safety, it might be to do with lighting, but it might be to do with use hanging in the area, or there could be lots of different explanations for that, and without understanding why something scored 3 or 4, you can't actually deliver on some of the priorities. Okay, finally, some of the limitations of the place standard tool I've mentioned already, limitations of the evaluation. I've mentioned already that the reach figures are likely to be underestimated. And also in terms of the case study examples, there's inevitable gaps. We know that the place standard has been used in various different ways, and we've only provided 5 case study examples, so there's gaps there. In terms of next steps and how we're using some of the findings of the evaluation to take some of the work forward in Health Scotland, is that we have taken some action to improve data collection on the website, so we now have a better understanding of reach. So whenever anyone logs on to the website to use the place standard tool, we now are able to collect some of that data there to give us a better understanding where it's been used and why it's been used. We've also made improvements to the online tool, so we were conscious that a lot of areas were using the place standard as a survey, and the online tool, the way it was about a year ago, wouldn't support that function, so you could only fill it out as one user and there was nowhere to collate that data in a central point, whereas now we've updated the online tool so you can create a unique ID, so we could create it for Saltcoats just now, and we could all go and carry out the place standard together and then generate a report from that. There's also some planned work to provide some guidance on how we actually analyse some of the qualitative data. So that's been described as a barrier by implementation leads. So what do you do with 2,000 responses, or what do you do with 50 responses? How do you analyse it? So we've planned some work to provide some guidance on how you analyse the data. And finally, we are exploring the potential to actually go back and follow up some of the case studies that we've been working with to see whether the police standard did have any impact, did it inform the locality plan, or were there barriers in place that prevented them from that. Okay, final slide here in terms of conclusions. Generally, since its launch, the police standard has been used a number of times to support community planning. Despite some of the variances in how it's been used, I think the evaluation findings are applicable if you want to use it in any different context. I think the kind of take-home message is that the police standard really does just provide a starting point for some of the place-based discussions, and it's key that some of the actions that come out of using the police standard tool are then delivered over time. There's a link to the full evaluation report if anyone wants to look at it and get a bit more detail. There's some case studies on there to give you some more examples of how it might be used, and I'm happy to take any questions.